Chapter 1. The Closet is Built. My Mother's Early Life, 1930 to 1949. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Marcellus, Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 4. My mother was born Marion Eleanor Zimmer on June 3, 1930, on a farm in Albany, New York. Her mother, Evelyn Parkhurst Conklin Zimmer, ran the farm and was a noted Scottish historian. Her father, Leslie Zimmer Sr., worked the farm and also worked as a carpenter since the farm did not produce enough to supplement them, and he was too proud to go on welfare. The oldest of three, my mother had two natural brothers, Leslie Jr. and the late Paul Edwin Zimmer, the youngest, as well as one adopted brother, Paul's childhood friend, Don Studebaker. From the time she was 3 years old, Marion made up stories, which her mother would dutifully transcribe. Over time, Marion, Paul, and Don all became writers, although my mother was the only one to achieve significant success. Leslie Jr. did not write, and he did not get along with any of the other three siblings, being more or less a chip off the old block. Marion's family lived in terrible poverty during the Great Depression. She remembered owning only one dress and walking to school every morning after milking the cows and performing other farm chores. She spoke of the cows with great affection. She never got along with Leslie Jr., whom she regarded as violent, and she was often in the position of having to defend both Paul and Don from him. Marion once quipped that her mother regarded a daughter as a handy household gadget. Afflicted with allergies and a serious arthritic condition, pain was a constant feature in my mother's life. She hated housework of any sort. Once she became a mother herself, Marion tried hard to avoid all housework, preferring to be the family breadwinner instead by earning money with her writing. Marion loved opera and had dreamed of becoming an opera singer herself one day. Every Saturday morning, she would listen to the Metropolitan Opera on the radio while she did the ironing. She hated ironing, but listening to the opera made it tolerable for her. My mother had a beautiful singing voice, but had, as she put it, neither the health nor the money to pursue a singing career. Even so, she would often walk around the house singing operatic arias. Her love for the aria Mi ci amano Mimi resulted in her brother Paul always calling her Mimi instead of Marion. There was a cultural schism in her childhood household, where Leslie Sr. regarded women as being fit for little more than cooking and cleaning. Leslie Sr. was a typical man of his era, the sort of man Archie Bunker might have been modeled after. He was often judgmental and narrow-minded. He objected to Marion's wish to attend college and wanted her to stay home and work on the family farm. My grandmother was in favor of my mother going to college, but she would not oppose my grandfather even to help Marion, and she was firmly in agreement with him concerning cooking and cleaning being female tasks. She left Marion to fight her own battle with her father alone. Marion loved school, regarding it as a refuge from her home. She also loved reading, especially science fiction, history, and music. The only thing she hated about school was the policy of making all girls play basketball. In the opinion of the school, the girls needed the exercise, an attitude which infuriated my mother. Between her farm chores, the constant pain of her arthritis, and the 5-mile walk from her home to the school, playing basketball added insult to injury. Once she is done with school, she refused to ever exercise again. My grandfather must have had some good qualities in him to induce my grandmother to marry him, but those good qualities vanished once tragedy struck his life. He turned to alcohol to cope with his grief when his sister drowned, and he began to abuse his wife and his daughter. He once threw my grandmother down the stairs and savagely beat both her and my mother on occasion. He raped Marion repeatedly in her young teens, always in the front seat of the family truck. He would drive my mother far enough away to be out of the view of the house and swear her to silence. When she finally called the police about the abuse, he was arrested. However, my grandmother forced my mother to drop the charges against him because his incarceration would end their meager income and the family would starve. After being released, my grandfather came home from jail, raped my mother once more, and told her, "Now we're even. We can be friends." Marion never forgave her mother for making her drop the charges and forcing her to endure yet another rape, and yet I sometimes heard her speak with kindness toward her father, although they did not remain in touch after she left home. My mother seemed to think her father had little control over himself because he was a drunk, and she blamed him less than he deserved. She often said, "People do drunk what they want to do sober." It was as though she held her father to a lower standard and accepted his crimes as natural failings, but she could not forgive her mother for failing to stop him. Marion did remain in contact with her mother until the latter's death, even though they did not get along. Even as a child, my mother was emotionally strong. She was a fighter at every point, always absolutely intent on doing things her own way. She told me that the one thing she said, which her mother hated most, was, "Me do it all myself." Her mother, naturally, wanted to help her, but Marion's need for independence was too great to accept it. Marion always considered herself to be a dwarf among giants. She was 5'2" and 3/4 inches, and very defensive about the 3/4 of an inch, as if it helped her feel taller. I've wondered if her pretense for great physical strength and power was a compensation for the helplessness she felt when she was brutalized by her father. I find it almost unbearable to imagine my grandfather physically overpowering my mother. It fills me with a fury and an outrage I cannot describe. I think I can understand her need to proclaim strength and endless victory, no matter what was happening. In her own heart, Marion probably felt that she had to win somehow, even if she lost. She found victory in not allowing her will to be destroyed by her father, and yet, her need to win meant that someone else had to lose. I can imagine my mother thinking, "I can't let him win. He can't get away with this. It is not fair for him to be bigger and stronger if this is what he's going to do." Ironically, she ended up emulating him in many ways because to survive required strength, and he was the strongest thing in her home. Psychologists are familiar with this phenomenon. They call it introjecting the abuser. Mother told me that she gave up on God because he didn't save her from her father. The results of this decision were tragic as, over time, it encouraged tens of thousands of her readers to follow in her footsteps, away from Christianity and into a spirituality that pretended to offer more. But no matter what spiritual practice she wandered into, it amounted to the same thing, a way for her to control divinity as a substitute for her own inability to control her father. As a result of her stubborn independence, Marion managed to get involved in a few things which upset her parents a lot. In her teens, Mother was fascinated with carnivals and dreamed of running away to the circus. She even worked in a local carnival as a target for a knife thrower named Dino. She had a scar on her breast because Dino once accidentally struck her in the chest with a knife when a photographer's flash momentarily blinded him. But it was always the trapeze artist that she loved the most, even though she knew that her rheumatoid arthritis would prevent her from ever becoming one. Marion's love for carnivals and the trapeze resulted in her early novel, The Flyers, later published as The Catch Trap. The Flyers was written in 1948 and published in 1979. It involved a love affair between a man and an underage boy. She would tell me much later that John Travolta wanted to make a movie of it, but only if he could replace the boy in the story with a girl. She was very proud of having refused Travolta, and of having insisted that her story must remain exactly as she wrote it. It seems curious that my mother's vision of sexuality was so twisted by the age of 18 that she would write a pederastic love story. Did her father's rapes somehow persuade her that sexuality was invariably cross-generational and coercive? Did it seem less threatening to displace a sexual relationship onto a man and a boy than write about a coercive love interest between an older man and a less powerful and younger girl? Or was there a real-life inspiration for The Catch Trap? I've heard, but I cannot prove, that my mother's brother Don's adoption came after he had a youthful sexual involvement with her much younger brother Paul. Since the rumors of their involvement are hearsay, and I know no details, I can only speculate that Paul and Don were the inspiration for the lovers in The Catch Trap. Where Don is an author who has been living as an openly gay man for many decades now, Paul Paul became the kind of hyper-masculine man who refused to neuter his male cats and had children with 3 different women, despite only being married to one of them. He spoke with fury of anyone who tried to neuter men by getting in the way of their full sexual expression with anyone. If anyone had suggested Paul was gay to his face, I expect he would have angrily denied it. Of course, in many cases, same-sex liaisons between younger people do not invariably create gay adults, nor even necessarily indicate a tendency that will be reliably followed. It is entirely possible to have an experimenting child end up not only straight, but very straight indeed. There is no shortage of examples of people who have been gay for decades, but eventually end up straight and married to partners of the opposite sex by choice. Marion was involved in science fiction fandom from the time of its inception in 1945. She was accustomed to spending hours in the school library reading everything she could find, sometimes even playing hooky from school to read at the library. Fortunately, she was well liked by the librarians who refused to turn her in. She especially liked the work of Henry Kuttner, Edmund Hamilton, C.L. Moore, and Lee Brackett, often mentioning the latter in our home. She wrote her first book in 1947 when she was 17, a rewrite of Bellini's opera Norma, which was published posthumously as The Forest House. Norma is about a powerful druidic priestess who has a forbidden relationship with a Roman and bears 2 children by him. He is unfaithful to her with her best friend Adalgisa, a younger and much less powerful woman. After contemplating killing her 2 children, she reveals the identity of her Roman lover to her people and is sentenced to death. She climbs atop his funeral pyre and dies with him. It might be informative to look through my mother's books to see if there are any positive relationships in them between older men and younger women, or if all such relationships were unequal and rooted in force. There are parallels between Norma and my mother's relationship with my unfaithful father. Walter abandoned her again and again for very young, powerless boys. Marion was writing for pulp magazines and publishing what we call fanzines today, even before she was out of high school. She was involved with Daystar, Ad Astra, and Anything Box, which may have been the inspirations for Zena Henderson's 1965 short story of the same name. Her first professional sale was the short story Outpost from an amateur fiction contest in Amazing Stories. Outpost was first published in the fanzine Space Warp, Volume 4, Number 3, in December 1948, and then in Amazing Stories, Volume 23, Number 12, the following December. Marion once said in an interview that she became a lesbian in her teens. Her father broke up one of her early lesbian relationships by calling the cops on her, but this only increased her determination to go her own way. It could be said that she had reclaimed her sexuality in a way her father was helpless to either control or to compete with. She was, in effect, conquering her rapist by repudiating his entire gender. Marion had a number of liaisons with women, including one named Dorothy, who was the namesake for my middle name. My mother always spoke well of Dorothy. There was also a longer, very dramatic and explosive relationship with a woman named Carrie. Marion seemed to have retained less friendship and fewer good feelings for Carrie than for Dorothy, though I do not know why. But I never knew my mother to accept any responsibility for the failure of her relationship. She eventually met a lesbian named Barbara Greer, who introduced her to a lesbian group called the Daughters of Bilitis, founded by 4 lesbian couples in San Francisco in 1955. Its original purpose was to counteract the loneliness felt by lesbians, and to later educate lesbians about rights and lobbying. My mother contributed to the latter, their newsletter, which began in 1956. She also wrote for its gay counterpart, the Mattachine Review. She wrote a succession of novels for Monarch Books. I Am a Lesbian, 1962, The Strange Woman, 1962, and Corinth Books, My Sister, My Love, 1963, Twilight Lovers, 1964, and No Adam for Eve, 1966, under different pseudonyms, including John Dexter, Miriam Gardner, and Lee Chapman. They were considered lesbian pornography at the time, although they were much tamer than anything we would regard as pornographic today. A complete list of her pseudonyms, the works she wrote under them, and their publication dates appears in the appendix containing her bibliography. Berrien's writing was one of several aspects of her life where she rejected femininity. In 1962, Damon Knight, whom she mentioned often at home, said that her work is distinctly feminine in tone, but lacks the cliches, overemphasis, and other kittenish tricks which often make female fiction unreadable by males. My impression is that she was more focused on the story than how she felt about it, and this is primarily what made her style seem so different from that of her female contemporaries. I believe she identified femininity with vulnerability to men, which to her meant violent rape. Thus, she found it intolerable. In a 1988 interview, she spoke with annoyance and disdain about having to wear one's hair a certain way or going along with any feminine stereotype. She did not want her characters to have a pair bond as their ultimate goal, especially not a conventional male-female one. There was never any happily ever after for her or her female characters. They were required to forge their own future from something other than love, or at least something other than blissful matrimony. Although Marion never affected the flannel shirt and khakis uniformly worn by the lesbians I grew up around in the Bay Area, it would have been difficult to imagine a less feminine woman than my mother. Her voice, her body language, her mannerisms, and her attitude all spoke of power, and only power, as the priority in dealing with other people. She was just as unfeminine in a dress as she was in pants. She never dressed to look nice, and she regarded doing so as a betrayal of feminism. She refused to value appearances and regarded doing so as selling out to the patriarchy. Feminine body language and behavior was considered to be repulsive and out of the question because it might attract men, and permitting men to be attracted by those things was wrong because it will teach them the wrong thing. She believed women were supposed to educate men to appreciate us only for our minds, and therefore it was a woman's responsibility to absolutely reject any male appreciation which is the result of our appearance or femininity. Any man who dares to love our femininity is an evil oppressor and should not be provided with any sex, ever. In my mother's imagination, for a woman to have sex with a masculine man was to risk her life as well as her sanity. Despite her intelligence, my mother never anticipated that men would quickly reason their way around this preposterous attitude. All a man needs to do to obtain sex from a feminist is to pretend to go along with these ideas in every way and insist that he only loves her for her mind. And he will be deemed trustworthy even more quickly if he is willing to assume a parasitic role and permit her to pay for everything. The most important thing is that a man cannot express any opinion about thin women being more attractive than fat women. The more a man can tolerate, or, better yet, pretend to desire fat women, the quicker he will be provided sex, the more female partners he will have access to, and the more his feminist partners will accept him having multiple partners. Apparently, we women are too dim-witted to figure out that rather than believing this feminist nonsense, men simply learned to tell us what we wanted to hear. After Marion graduated from high school, she attended the New York State College for Teachers, now known as University at Albany, SUNY, from 1946 to 1948. Her goal was to become a teacher, but she dropped out, mostly because her father believed that education on a woman was like lips on a chicken, and he refused to support her. In response, she told him she would marry the first kind, decent, sober man who asked her, and that is exactly what she did. Marion married the 50-year-old Robert Alden Bradley on October 26, 1949, when she was only 19. They had corresponded for 3 years but never met. She always called him Brad. Brad was a fellow science fiction fan, and he was very supportive of her writing. Marion felt that Brad was a marvelous conversationalist, and told me that the reason she stayed with Brad as long as she did, despite their many differences, was this. He knew he could trust me with his money, and we never ran out of things to talk about. She was grateful to Brad for teaching her to drive and for sending her to college at Hardin-Simmons. Marian graduated with 3 majors, in English, Spanish, and psychology. Her Spanish was good enough to permit her to write a credible translation of El Villano en su Rincón by Lope de Vega that she printed privately in 1971. She was also interested in parapsychology, though not religion. The only religion she consistently claimed in my hearing was spiritualism, and she took Rosicrucianism very seriously. She also took voice lessons in college. She loved Gilbert and Sullivan and continued to sing throughout her life. Brad and Marian had 1 son, my late half-brother David Robert Bradley, 1950 to 2008, but she desperately wanted more children, and Brad absolutely did not. When she became pregnant again after David was born, he obliged her to have an abortion. When Marian refused to have any more abortions, Brad simply declined to ever have sex with her again. She hated him for this and cited it as the primary reason she left him for my father after 16 years of marriage. Toward the end of her life, she told me that Brad was a very strange man who reminded her of a space alien, although she couldn't really explain any reason for it. She also told me that she never cried anymore and didn't like crying because she did nothing but cry for over a year after she had first married, and it had never done her a damned bit of good. That being said, she did cry rather a lot while I was young. I can hardly blame her, between her absolutely appalling upbringing, the never-ending poverty she experienced, and the unhappy end of her first marriage. She was not one to put up with anyone else crying either, regardless of age or reason. After all, crying was a sign of weakness, and proof that a woman was not strong enough to solve her own problems. Not long after Marian left Brad, my grandmother unexpectedly left Leslie Sr. and moved to California with Paul and Don after catching Leslie Sr. in a compromising position with a cow. My mother told me this story with a combination of amusement and fury, upset that her mother had more concern for the morals and modesty of the cow than for her own daughter. The other factor contributing to my grandmother's departure was a series of violent altercations between Leslie Jr. and Don, in which Leslie Jr. was the instigator and Don got the worst of it. I am told that when my grandmother left and they carried the old piano out of the house, the only thing Leslie said to her was, "Babe, would you turn on the TV?" Armchair psychology. Marian's mother is passive and does not protect her from her violent, sexually abusive father. Her father is the strongest personality in her house. In psychological theory, introjecting the abuser means we would take on traits of the strongest parent instead of the weakest one, regardless of the parent's sex. Marian learned that love was not available from either men or women, and that the only way to obtain freedom was to get married and, eventually, to make her own money. She also learned that violence was acceptable and tended to coincide with power. Marian learned that although women were safer than men, they were not entirely safe either. She had relationships with women that were hysterical and highly dramatic. Her most stable love relationships were with men, despite the drama she brought to them. Marian was married to Brad for 16 years, and to my father for 34 years. Even when she had been with Lisa for 20 years, Marian still described Walter as the love of her life. Marian learned that sex was fundamentally coercive, and that she would either be forced or she would force. One sees this again and again in the unequal relationships and in the unsatisfactory substitutes for conventional male-female relationships she created in her writing. The renunciates, or free Amazons, in her Darkover book gave up the right to marry, based on her idea that simply shacking up instead of getting married would magically create a superior relationship. It was Marian's vision that living together without marriage vows would somehow sidestep the coercive, unequal situation she equated with marriage. But while reversing the power dynamic and vesting it with women might seem an obvious way to right the coercive wrongs of the marriage structure, it did not work. Marian held all the power in her family, and yet she was not only cruel and punitive, but irrational and would punish others savagely on a whim. The matriarchy she created was not just and good, it was oppressive and terrifying, and left her children feeling like caged animals, wishing for escape or death, and much too frightened to cry. Marion appeared to have fused femininity with helplessness and vulnerability in her mind. She wrote characters into her books ranging from the most oppressed to the least, and seemed to handle those still in their figurative or literal chains with sensitivity and kindness. Invariably, her characters who escaped oppression did so by rejecting their femininity and taking on a more masculine persona in an obvious echo of her own life's path. Marion was given a model of educated, intelligent, and oppressed womanhood in her mother, and while she rejected the oppression to which she was subjected, she also rejected her own womanhood, becoming instead a female caricature of her violent father. Primarily due to her intelligence, Marion was able to attract 2 husbands, although she was not happy with either of them. She conflicted relationship with sex, almost guaranteed that she would end up pursuing relationships with men where sex was either problematic or non-existent, as was the case in both of her marriages. Marion was fundamentally unable to trust other people. As a child, she went to her mother for help, but was betrayed and sent back to her father to endure more abuse. Psychologists describe the basis of the borderline conflict as an abused child going back and forth between father and mother, looking for love and safety, but not finding it in either of them. As a result of her borderline conflict, Marion became a violent, masculinized woman, hating and mistrusting men, and only able to tolerate those who were neither conventionally masculine nor feminine. Ironically, she ended up internalizing her father's oppressive version of masculinity, and he lived on through her. In the end, Marion became the very oppressor she hated.